Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is David, and in today's video I would like to give you a book review of Anthony Burgess' novel A Clockwork Orange. As I record this video, it is Banned Books Week in 2025 in the US, and so every year PEN America publishes a list of the books most frequently banned from public and school libraries in the US during the current year, and something that many people consider a strange and intolerable form of censorship. So PEN seems to think the same way, and so in this second week of October, PEN calls for the Banned Books Week. So they are inviting people to read books from this list and talk about them and to give them some visibility and publicity and to cause some attention for this act of book banning and censorship. So fortunately, some booktubers are also participating in this campaign, trying to give visibility to these books. And I became aware of this campaign through MJ from the channel Reading This Live. And I would also like to do my part. And so some of you might wonder why I'm participating in this, because, you know, I'm German, I'm not living in the US. But so the reason is it's linked to our history here in Germany, because there was a dark period in our history when books were removed from libraries and banned or even burned because the topics or the authors did not appeal to the ideology of a certain political and societal group. And this dark phase did not end well for our country, as you are sure aware of. And we have to thank the American society, and in particular the American soldiers, for having liberated us from this pestilential ideology back in 1945. And so yeah, it feels a bit strange that nowadays there's still a revival of this sort of thinking, of trying to ban books that do not match well a certain ideology, and working with book bans and removing books from libraries. It just feels wrong. So I would like to leave it at this as regards my motivation for this video. This is not a political channel, but I'm concerned that nowadays we see that there's some group of people who want to ban books from public libraries or school libraries. So the front runner on the current list of the list 2025, the book with the most bans in this year, is Anthony Burgess' novel A Clockwork Orange. So I think it's a good choice to present this book as my contribution to the Banned Books Week 2025. And I'll approach this book review by first outlining the plot of the novel. And the second chapter of my video, I will try to explain why some readers may find this book offensive, and what also the publication history and the film adaptation may have to do with this. And then I will say a few words about the main topic and message of the book as I understand it, and I will try to explain why I think this is actually a highly moral book. And I will also say something about, of course, its literary quality. And as a bonus, in the final chapter of this video, I will provide a bit of background information on the author and the situation he was in when writing this novel. I can access all the chapters of my videos by using the timestamps, of course. So number one, the plot. So the plot can be divided into three parts. And the first part, um, we learn that a teenager named Alex leads a youth gang with his his three friends, Pete, Georgie, and Dim, in a sort of dystopian England of the near future, calculated from the time of publication. So it feels like the 1970s, more or less. And this group commits really horrible nightly acts of violence, of robbery, and of assault, and of rape. And this Alex, the gang leader, is a strange person. On the one hand, he is organizing these violent acts. On the other hand, he seems to be intelligent and cultivated. He loves classical music, especially Beethoven. And uh, all this whole novel is told from his first person narrator's perspective. And he is describing the actions in a sort of an invented youth slang, and a language called Netzet, which strongly builds on many loan words from the Russian language. And so in this first part, we observe some of these horrible, violent acts of the group, and then we'll see that also that there are some internal power struggles in this group, and Alex is betrayed by his group members, his so-called droogs, and he's arrested by the police. And in the second part, Alex is in prison, and he undergoes he agrees to undergo a special experimental therapy, a sort of psychological conditioning therapy that is intended to condition him in a way so that in the future he will abhor any form of violence. He will be unable to perform any form of violent acts in the future, and he will even be unable to think even about violence. And they hope to achieve this by forcing Alex to watch violent films while being stimulated in a way so that he feels nauseous the whole time. I think there may be some psychoactive substances included. So, and then they call this Ludovico treatment, which is a sort of an ironic reference to Ludwig van Beethoven, the pet composer of Alex. And so the treatment seems to be successful. It does indeed render Alex incapable of committing violence or of even thinking about violent acts, but it also robs him of his beloved classical music of Beethoven because it had accidentally been included in this conditioning experiments and process. So released as cured, Alex is now more or less defenselessly exposed to a hostile world in which he encounters former victims, but also other opponents and who want to take revenge on him, or people who want to exploit him. So, and this is what the third part is about. Alex, in the beginning of the third part, he's brutally beaten up by his former friends, his former droogs, who have now changed sides, and they have become police officers, and they enjoy their new role and their ability to impose acts of violence, but in a form that is sanctioned, approved by the state. And Alex is also exploited by a group of political dissidents who want to discredit the government. There's some irony in the fact that one of the key figures of this dissident group is the husband of one of Alex's former victims. So there are some side plots in there. So after a failed suicide attempt and some subsequent medical treatment, the Alex notices that the effect of the Ludovico treatment seems to have worn off, has vanished. So he is returned to the normal previous Alex. And one might think that everything then was pointless and that the violent excesses would begin again, but things do not develop that way. On the contrary, there is a positive ending. At least in the original British version, there is the final chapter, the 21st chapter. In this chapter, Alex undergoes a character improvement or sort of maturation. He loses interest in violence. He quits his violent way of thinking, of living, and he starts to dream of a normal future with a family. So this book actually ends with Alex's moral maturation and purification, a moral change that is not forced by a state authority or by a clever psychological treatment imposed on him, but it is a moral change that is triggered by his own internal maturation process. And the strange thing is, and the damaging thing for the reputation of the book is that in the film adaptation and still in the public perception, things look different because this final chapter is frequently omitted. But we'll come to that in a moment. So, chapter 2 of my video, why do some readers find this book offensive? So, I think this book is often banned from public libraries and school libraries because critics focus on this explicit depiction of violence, of sexual content, and they think that this book may contain some glorification of crime and violence, but this is simply not true. So undeniably, the first part of the novel contains depictions of violence, including sexual assaults and rape and obscene language. However, the critics overlook the fact that Burgess deliberately portrays violence as repulsive, and that the entire, if you take a look at it from the context of the entire novel, it becomes very clear that the entire novel is a parable against both violence but also totalitarian oppression. So the actual morality message of the book is that morality can only exist in a situation where there is free choice, including also the choice to do evil, and that any state coercion to goodness, to avoiding evil acts, it's not moral. It's even more inhuman or at least at the same level of immorality and inhumanity than the violence created by individuals. So this highly moral message is systematically ignored in the attempts to censor or to ban this book. And ironically, the book in itself criticizes precisely this kind of authoritarian control that censors themselves exercise by depriving readers of the choice to grapple with the uncomfortable moral questions that the book is posing. Okay, so number three, where does this come from? So I think this simplified perception of the book certainly has something to do with its publication history, and particularly in the United States, and with its film adaptation. As I mentioned, in the original British version, and also in most other international translations, the book appeared in the form as Burgess had planned and written it, with all its 21 chapters. In the US, however, at the beginning of the 1960s, the publisher felt that this positive, happy ending was too banal, too kitschy, and did not fit in with the more pessimistic American zeitgeist of the early 1960s. And so the publisher made it a condition that for the book to be promoted on the American market, the final positive chapter must be deleted for the US market. And Burgess was in a great personal and financial difficulties at the time, so he was simply not in a position to negotiate this. He could not afford to disagree. So, and this gave American readers the impression that this was not only a dystopian, violence glorifying novel, but also a pessimistic one, ending without a moral. And this continued until 1988, I think, was the first time that a complete version was published on the American market. And the fatal thing is also that Stanley Kubrick's film adaptation, that on the one hand made the novel really famous, it is also based on this abridged American version of the novel without the final positive chapter. So, and as a result, in particular, the American audience, even those who have read the book, they have a rather distorted image and understanding of the novel and of its message. So the actual theme and main message of the book, which are highly moral and even downright traditionally Christian, they have been lost sight of. So let's talk about what is the actual theme and message of the book, as far as I understand it. So I think I already mentioned this in a side remark a little bit earlier. What I think is the main theme and message of the book. The book is a plea for morality, but for a morality based on free choice, and it actually analyzes to the extreme. So what does it mean? What would a moral without free choice, would it have any value or meaning? So and the message of the book is, forced moral behavior is worthless, and it's not only worthless, it also destroys people and our human nature. Of course, we need laws to protect people from being damaged by others, but coercion, trying to force the individual to just be good, just to do good things, and if this enforcement is also linked with violence and manipulation, psychological tricks and things like that, and it is just as immoral as this teenage form of violence. So the book is a plea for moral people, but for people who do not follow like an automatic device, any moral that was forced onto them or psychologically programmed into them by any state authority or smart psychological tricks, but it's about people who come to abhor and to avoid violence and other forms of immorality through their character development, through maturation. Okay, so why do I think that this is a moral book? My guess is that reservations about the book often come from evangelical type Christians, and that is why I want to focus in this video on some arguments why I consider A Clockwork Orange to be a moral book, and with a focus on why this book is particularly interesting and valuable for Christian readers, and why Christians who take their faith seriously should not ban this book, but should read it and could even come to the point where they love it instead of trying to remove it from libraries. So with this message, this book touches on a core theme of Christian theology. This is, after all, also a sort of Christian paradox. God created man with free will, even though he knew that man could choose and would choose sin and evil. But man has also the free will to choose against evil and for good. And so our moral value and our uniqueness as human beings lies precisely in this freedom of choice. And this is what also the prison chaplain, one of the few unambiguously moral characters in the novel, what he um, articulates precisely in his theological position. I'm not quoting verbatim, but more as closely. So goodness is something that you choose. When a person cannot choose, it ceases to be a person, to be a human. So this reflects also, I think, the Christian teaching that any enforced morality, a morality that makes us operate like a remotely controlled robot, that any morality without free will, without the real possibility of do otherwise, it becomes meaningless and it becomes immoral in itself. So God created humans, created man in his own image as his counterpart, that is, as a creature with free will, and not as a puppet or as a robot bot that is just simply programmed to be only good and has no choice but to fulfill God's will. So the moral value is in having the free will and doing out of free choice, avoiding evil and doing good things. So and Burgess shows that any state or government that presumes to shape people and to program them and to create a sort of new improved human being, and that this and by programming them, forcing them and depriving them of the free will and of the possibility of sin through this form of coercion, that such a government is something deeply godless, unchristian. It's a parody of divine omnipotence. And so any state or any authority that attempts to create sinlessness through coercion of humans by trying to reprogram them, it just creates another godless form of hell. So and in this original version with its 21st chapter, Alex then undergoes a genuine internal moral development. He outgrows violence, and this is not achieved through any external coercion by any government authorities, not through clever psychological conditioning or reprogramming, but it's through natural maturation and growing inside. And I think this also corresponds nicely to the Christian concept of inner conversion, of one's own free will. So this, I think, actually, this book is very close to standard Christian doctrine and something that is not at all immoral. Yes, immoral behavior and in Christianity it's called sin. This is bad, it's repulsive, it is disturbing. And this is also described in the first part of the novel. It's not glorified. It's described in a way that it might have for certain people of a certain immature stage some sort of attractiveness, but from the outer perspective, it's repulsive and it's not glorified. If you consider the whole context of the novel, it becomes very clear that this sort of violence is criticized and portrayed as a misguided path. So that is the paradox in the novel. Alex's former violence and misdoings. This is the prerequisite for his later redemption. And Alex, who was forcibly programmed to behave morally, this approach failed, and it would not be morally good or a redeemed human being in the Christian sense either. So he would be a robot, but not a human being. Christian redemption requires the sinner with his or her free will to be able to choose freely the good side or the bad side. So in my view, this novel is incredibly exciting and enriching, especially for Christian readers, because it forces them to critically examine certain ideas. The question of the so-called theodicy. So why does God allow evil through free will? What is the value of any form of enforced morality? Is it Christian to prescribe moral behavior by a law, or to enforce it by clever tricks of psychological programming, by coercion? Is it moral to use psychological manipulation to make people do what is supposedly morally good? So I think these are all very valuable and very stimulating ideas. And the novel shows that some of these ideas are impulses that are deeply unchristian, inhuman, and morally worthless. So human societies, especially those that are at the same time scientifically advanced and also deeply religious, they might be tempted to try to solve social or moral problems through behaviorist techniques and psychological manipulation or other forms of coercion. But Anthony Burgess here takes a deeply Christian counterposition in this book here, arguing that respect for human dignity, that for man being created in the image of God and a being with a free will, that this also means accepting the possibility of sin. And forced virtue is a lie, but virtue born out of insight, of repentance, or in Christian terms of grace. This is not only possible, but only the only valuable form of morality. So the novel is a strong defense of both Christian values and of free will, and it is written not in spite of, but because of the author's sort of Christian convictions. Okay, so number 6. What is this novel's value from a literary perspective? I don't want to reduce the novel to its moral message. I have only elaborated on this point because I think this is where the greatest misunderstandings lie, and these misunderstandings might be the cause for the book being banned so open. But first and foremost, we are of course dealing with a literary work that has a value for literary and aesthetic reasons. And this is why I would also like to discuss a few specific literary aspects here. First of all, the structure of the book. It shows that we are dealing with a very carefully composed piece of literary work here. The structure of the novel is very mathematically precise and has a profound symbolic meaning. There are 21 chapters, and these are divided into 3 parts of 7 chapters each. And so this is not an arbitrary structure, but a really meaningful framework, also with symbolic meaning of the numbers. So the numbers 3 and 7 are both highly symbolic numbers in Christian and Western culture. The 3-part structure reflects classical dramaturgical and theological patterns like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or sin, punishment, and redemption. And 7 is the number of creation, the number of divine order and perfection. So each of the 3 phases must be completed in 7 subchapters, in 7 stages, like the 7 days of creation or the 7 days of the week, etc. So there are symbolic references galore. And the product of both numbers, 7 times 3, is 21. This represents also the age of maturity and in the British context at the time of writing. That is the point at which a person is considered morally fully responsible. And this coincides with this moral change maturity of Alex. So this whole structure underscores the novel's thesis. Alex must go through 3 times 7 equals 21 stages, chapters, years to reach moral maturity. And then there's language, of course. Burgess invents this artificial Nadsat slang for teenagers, and English interspersed with numerous Russian words. And so also the name of the language Nadsat has a meaning. It's derived from the Russian term Nadsat, which is the ending of Russian numbers for the teenage numbers, 13 to 19, like the ending teen in English. So Nadsat is the Russian ending of these teenage numbers. And so it makes sense to have this name for a language or a slang for teenagers. And so the language it's more than just a stylistic gimmick. It is the central artistic device of the novel. The language fulfills several functions at once. It initially alienates the reader, forcing them to actively decode the text and thus preventing a too close voyeuristic sensationalist reading of the violent scenes. And this phonetic similarity, Burgess chooses Russian words that have a phonetic similarity to certain other English words that have also create a strange familiar meaning within the same context. So the words sound almost familiar but remain foreign. So this is because Burgess he had learned Russian, he knew Russian, and he chooses his Russian words with an extraordinary phonetic sensitivity. So the keyword horror show, it's a Russian word, хорошо, that means good. But I think it's a brilliant example because in English ears, it sounds хорошо sounds like horror show, so suggesting violence and spectacle, but it actually means good. So a perfect reflection of this contrasting tension or contradiction at the level of content. And so this perverse aesthetic of violence that Alex worships in the first part, it's beautifully encapsulated in this wordplay, хорошо, good, or horror show. And there are other examples. So his friends are not friends, they're called drug, and drug is just the Russian word for friend, but it's phonetically reminiscent of drug, and it hints at this sort of toxic, addictive nature of these friendships. Or Tolchok, which is how they call their activity of these violent episodes. Tolchok, it's a Russian word for a push, for a blow, but it has an onomatopoetic quality that imitates this dull thud of a blow, Tolchok. And Gulliver, so it's also another brilliant device. On the one hand, it's just a slight modification of the Russian word golova for head, but Burgess anglicizes it in a way so that it recalls this novel Gulliver by Jonathan Swift, whose satirical tradition Burgess obviously aims to imitate or to continue. So there are more than 200 artificial words, and in this novel, some editions provide a glossary, others leave it up to the reader to gradually figure out the meaning for themselves. So, and then the rhythm of the language is also an element that Burgess has very consciously crafted. So Alex, like the lover of classical music he likes this sort of cadenced rhythm, the rhythmic sentences with repetitive, almost ceremonial elements. So, quote, he said, there was me, that is Alex, and my three droogs, that is Pete, Georgie, and Dim. So, also violence is clothed in an almost lyrical, rhythmic language, and this is a contrast between the language and the content with a very strange effect on the reader, and also a disturbing subliminal message. So this aestheticization of inhumanity can give it a seductive character to which people become susceptible. Okay, so and also that's about language. Also, the narrative perspective is cleverly chosen. On the one hand, it's the first person narrative from Alex's perspective. It creates a certain familiarity and identification on a human level with this person, with this, but he comes across partly as likable, as intelligent, seductive in places, but on the other hand, he becomes increasingly repulsive. The more the reader understands this nutsat slang, the more the reader becomes aware of what the nature of the atrocities that are described in this trivializing sounding nutsat slang, and the more the reader learns also how unreliable this narrator is, then the distancing of the reader from this Alex begins to grow. So this the moral paradox is also thus reflected in an aesthetic paradox. On the one hand, this Alex is a person like you and me. You can relate to him. You find it sometimes even sort of attractive and fascinating, but he also has, if you take a closer look at it, if you really understand what he is doing, it becomes repulsive, perverse. You become aware of these immoral sides. And on the other hand, you still are aware of that, yeah, he is immoral and perverse, but on the other hand, he's so much like us. So that also you may start to question yourself when reading this novel. So as readers become aware of, do we sometimes allow ourselves to be drawn into a sort of voyeuristic aesthetic enjoyment of this description of violence by this aesthetic pull of the language? So this is, I think, an uncomfortable but important question that we should ask ourselves. I think it's very obvious that the author wants us to ask ourselves these uncomfortable questions about our own morality and our own fascination by the evil. So my conclusion is that this is not at all a book that glorifies violence, and it's also not one that was written with the aim of satisfying simple voyeuristic needs or adolescent fantasies of violence and sex. But it's a highly moral and a literarily complex work that is certainly disturbing in some respects, but it deserves to be read and discussed. Okay, final chapter, a sort of a biographical bonus about the author and his situation when he wrote this book. Anthony Burgess wrote this book in a really exceptional and very challenging biographical and psychological situation. In 1960, he was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor, and he was told that he had only a year to live. And so this was a very shocking diagnosis, and in order to realize as much of his writing plans as possible, he threw himself into his work with the ambitious plan to write 10 novels in the year he had left. For two reasons. First, to realize all his literary plans that he had, and also to secure his wife's financial position after his death. So the project did not go entirely according to plan for two reasons. On the negative side, so he only managed to write 5.5 novels in that 1 year, including Clockwork Orange. On the positive side, though, his brain tumor turned out to be a wrong diagnosis. So he lived for another 30 plus years. So so it was a very challenging, extraordinary situation when he wrote this book. And what is also interesting to know is that in this book, he also processes his own biographical and traumatic experiences. A couple of years earlier, in I think 1944, his first wife, Lynn, she was attacked and robbed and beaten and kicked by a gang of 4 deserting and drunk soldiers, I think, in London. And she suffered a miscarriage from that as a result of that attack. She was traumatized. I think her subsequent alcoholism and early death are also linked to this assault. And so it's what, and you may notice that what Burgess is describing in this first part of the novel are scenes that very much look like what his wife had suffer in, but caused a trauma for the whole family, this miscarriage of the child. So it is also a special literary form of self-therapy of a post-traumatic disorder, and it's a desperate attempt to somewhat comprehend and understand the emergence of such monstrosities and violence acts by trying to put himself into the perpetrator's perspective. So what could have been going on in the heads of these young men who attacked his young pregnant wife? So when, as a reader now, we know that this background to this novel and to the exceptional existential situation in which it was written. So the author believes he only has a few months to live, and also, if you know this biographical background, his own wife and unborn child were victims of this very sort of violent excesses committed by young people. Against this background, I think it becomes clear how silly and inappropriate and perverse it is to accuse this author and this book of immorality and of glorifying violence and this and nonsense like this. Okay, so I would like to conclude my video here. I think this book, it belongs in every public library. It belongs also on the curriculum of the higher education. And banning this book is a disgrace for any civilized country and society. Okay, thanks for watching this video. I hope you have enjoyed it. Let me know your comments. If you've read the book, the complete version, I hope, let me know your comment, your point of view on this book in the comment section. I'm very much looking forward to that. Okay, so and hope to see you next time and wish you a very good reading time. Take care, bye-bye, and ciao.